Start the recording. So today's tutorial is there is going to be a little brief kind of some tips and tricks for adding materials to your model. Just because we did talk about ambient occlusion, but we didn't really get into some of the other capabilities and options that you have with Maya. I'm just going to So if we go into our Hypershade, I'll show you how to create a transparent kind of glass material with a bit of a reflective property to it. When you start to do some of these more basic materials, the best thing to do is on your side bar here in the Hypershade, you go under the Arnold shaders. And if you go under Surface, you'll see the AI standard material, which if you click, you have a very kind of basic gray material that you can work with. And so we'll just call this glass. And one of the things that you should always do when you start is just make sure that it's under Arnold and not hardware in the top toolbar. When it comes to more transparent materials, it's always good to have a bit of a background so you can see how the object interacts with the space. And so in order to create kind of a glass material, the first thing that you'll do is you'll kind of set the color to black. And then you'll go down to the specular area, which is kind of the area that creates the gloss or the shine. And what you'll do is you'll start to sorry, I did all of this earlier. So you'll click onto the Fresnet option in the lower end here. So if you click onto that, you'll see that right underneath there's the Lichtavant at normal. And if you start to turn this up, you'll see that it starts to don't know why it's Lichtavant normal. Oh, well, the option is really just to turn that up. I'll show you why in a moment. It's really when we get into the more refractive nature, but I usually set this guy at 0.9 when I'm creating a glass material. And then as we go down through, the reflection options are usually fine the way they are with the internal reflections ticked on. And then you get down to the refraction layer where it gets a little bit more critical. So you'll turn the refraction weight way up, and you'll start to see that the material is starting to respond and create kind of that transparent glow. And then if you go into the IOR, which really influences how light kind of bends around the material, and you start to turn that up, you start to kind of really create that that glass effect. And I'll go up a little bit because I feel like the reason why it's so why that black is in the center is because the specular is a little bit low. So you really play between the specular properties, the weight, the roughness, as well as the rotation will impact how the light kind of responds to the material itself, and you can kind of really map out how the material is influenced by its surroundings. So to kind of reiterate what you do through the diffuse, you bring the color back, you bring in the Fresnet and the specular, as well as turn up the reflectant at normal, and then you just have to play around with the refraction by turning the weight up, as well as kind of toggling the IOR to influence how the light interacts with the space it's in. And you can start to create very different light effects. I think also what is causing some of the unusual nature in here is the fact that the roughness in the specular is still up. Whereas if you start to reduce the roughness, it becomes more of a clear glass. Whereas when you start to toggle up the roughness, it starts to become more of a brushed glass material.
Alex?
Yeah.
So, like, do you have an external lighting condition on that as well, or is that all just within the material?
This is all within the Hypershade,
okay.
so it's completely separate from the actual model plane.
Okay.
But we'll get into lighting in a minute, and I'll show you what you can do. So that's the basic rundown for creating a basic glass material. You just have to play between these different sliders in order to kind of create the glass effect that you were hoping to achieve. But just to remind you again, when it comes to the final model for this weekend, this is more of just for your knowledge later on in Maya. The explorations this weekend are, you're supposed to restrict your materials quite a bit. So don't just make the entire thing glass, for example, and use that. It won't fly. I'll also show you how to make a metallic structure. So if you go under the shader again, we're going to get that basic standard material one more time. And similar to the glass, we're going to set the diffuse back down to black. And we'll also bring the weight down to 0 as well. And so when we get down to the specular, we bring that guy up to 1, and you can start to see it's already creating that kind of metallic kind of output that we were hoping to get. But I'm going to start actually with a chrome material, which means I'm going to turn the roughness of the specular way down, which then starts to create that kind of gloss effect that we kind of had going on with that that glass render that I had before, but still a bit different. And then we'll have to go down and make sure that Fresnet is toggled, and then we can start to play with that kind of the reflectiveness of the normals of the surface until we kind of create that a kind of really glossy metallic effect that could be used later on for certain areas in your future studio models. Does anybody have any questions about how these were made, or is it, yeah? Yeah, so in Maya 2018, it actually, I believe, is quite a bit more straightforward, because if you look into specular, and I did see this before when I looked into the different interface, and I noticed that there was there's a metallic slider at the bottom of the specular, which is what you actually toggle instead. I can take a look for you and show you, but there's a specific slider that acts very similar to the reflectant at normal that that creates the same kind of glossy effect, but it does still have the roughness and the specular weight and everything else there. Am I correct? It doesn't have that. Okay. At the bottom, what is the bottom slider in that specular? And there's nothing over that sounds... we'll get to that after. I really need to switch this over to 2018 then, if it's that different. I'll also, when it comes to the standard material, I'm just clicking onto another standard. When it comes to texture mapping, I'm just going to give you a brief idea of how to do it rather than go through the entire thing, because it's not detrimental for this this next term project. But if you click on a standard material and you look next to the diffuse, the color, there is a little checkbox here, a checker, which you can click onto, which gives you a whole range of options for texture mapping. You can add noise to the top of it, as well as like a checkered pattern or a cloth pattern to it. But if you click onto File, it will take you into this page here, and you'll see that you have a few different options. Like there's the box pattern of mapping, the quadratic, where basically the pattern is mapped on, and Gaussian, which kind of creates I guess blurred around the edges. But I usually just keep it at quadratic. And if you click under image name, you'd be able to go into sorry, was that a question? Yeah.
Do we have to import all of the materials,
There are libraries where you would be able to import certain materials, but when it comes to some of the basic ones, you can kind of just map them out yourself, and it gives you a little bit more authorship over your materials, I guess. But Madiar, do you know of any texture libraries that might work with Maya? No. Do you usually just bring in your own materials then? Okay.
There's something called AppShaders. So you go, I think you might have to pay.
Okay. Well, when it comes to some of the basic materials, actually, I do find when it comes to rendering, a lot of the most effective materials come from adding them onto Photoshop afterwards. But when it comes to some of the basic transparencies versus metallics, they're very easy to just quickly make in Maya. And but I can get back to that question later. But if you go into wherever it is that you have a PNG document that has, for example, a wood texture, you would be able to bring that in, and then it will update and it will start to map that out onto your shader ball. So that's just kind of a quick rundown of some of the material options that you'd have in order to kind of create photorealistic renders later on. But one of the things that you will actually need is kind of environmental lighting. Might help you guys out for this this next submission. So I'll go into this guy here, and I'll just make sure that he has a standard material on him. So I'll bring back standard, and I'll just and I don't know if you guys remember, but if you just click the center wheel and you drag it over the object, you would be able to adjust it, or you'd be able to bring that material onto the object itself into the real space. Or if you right click it and assign material to selection, that will also add the material onto the object. Now, when it comes to kind of creating an environmental shadow and shading, Arnold has a few options. We went through some of the lightings before when it came to the point lights, the spotlights, and the quad lights. I remember that there were some problems with the updating of the rendering, but today I'm going to show you the Skydome light. So if you go into Arnold, you go under lights, and you go into Skydome, it will kind of create this, it will map out this orb around your entire scene, which can be used to map out kind of an ambient sunlight. And if you look under the attributes editor, you'll see you can adjust the color as well as the intensity, the resolution, and some of the shadow effects and how you cast the shadow onto the object itself. So right now, I'm just going to try to do a quick render of the So right now with the basic material, it creates just kind of like an ambient glow over it. It would look very similar to your ambient occlusion renders that you created beforehand, but now there are actual shadows being cast below. So as the intensity is increased, it will create a more pronounced shadow. I'm going to reduce the amount of times I do this render view, just because I remember last time it kind of created a few problems. But you can see that the intensity then kind of completely starts to wash out the color and resolution. So you'd be able to kind of play around with how you want shadows to be cast, and then just play around with it and update it and see how the object adjusts to these changes. So, any questions? Is everyone all right with that so far? Yeah?
Sorry, what does volume samples do? You adjusted that.
When it came to the volume samples, I believe it's to do with the volumetric shadow. So it just kind of increases that value. I was just trying to create kind of a difference between the shadow and light. And so if you go into the render settings, it will give us an option where we can kind of create more of a environmental kind of physical skylight, which Maya could do, which is actually kind of really interesting when it comes to some of your renderings. So if you go under the Arnold renderer, you'll see in the drop-down menu that there's an environment option. And if you click onto that, you can see that you can create a sky shader, a physical sky, as well as a ray switch. Basically, the physical sky and the sky shaders are the two that you'd be more interested in. It just kind of helps to create more of a realistic background. You also have an atmosphere option, which can create kind of AI fog if you want to create more of a moodier render, but we'll stick with the skylight for now. Just want to let you know that it exists. And so if we click onto that and we close, you'll see that now we've got kind of a surface material for the AI. And if we do a render, you can see that there's a change in the environmental render. Sorry, it might just take a moment. The reason why that didn't work was I'd have to go into Hypershade because that physical skylight is a material that can then be applied onto the dome light. So if you select the dome light and you go into the physical sky material that now exists, you'd be able to drag that in here and adjust the color based on that. So now if we go into our render, it should create that kind of physical sky quality. There we go. One of the things is when it comes to the main plane, it doesn't render the sky below that because it's really set up for you to create perspective renders with that sky. But the main feature and the main interest is really the glow and the shadow that comes off the and how it plays with the volume itself, rather than actually having the sky, because you probably want to change that in Photoshop afterwards anyways. And so one of the things that didn't exist when you had the ambient occlusion renders, but now exists, is you can see that the shadow is cast in certain areas, and again you can really you can toggle through those and create some variant changes. Let's just move around. To kind of give you an idea of how the light is working with your scene when you bring it in to do the post-production. And also how it interacts with other objects that you might have on your plane, because you might have like a city scene that you're working with, for example, and it's just a way to help you kind of understand how the forms are interacting. And so those are some kind of basic tips and tricks when it comes to materials and shadow lighting. So Shay will come up in a minute and kind of help you through some of the post-production in Photoshop.